Okay, so today I'm just going to go through three relatively brief surahs, starting with Surah 101, which is called the Terrible Calamity. And this is one of the names for the Day of Judgment. There are a couple of them: Al Haka, Tama, Saka, which are they're just all there are a few for the names of the Day of Judgment. These surahs are kind of grouped next to each other. This is a Meccan surah, which is why it's relatively short, around 11 verses. And it begins with, or 101. It's like 101 Dalmatians. The surahs just, there are so many of them to keep track of. Um, Only they're not as cute as Dalmatians. So this is the Terrible Calamity, or the Al Korea, and it could also mean catastrophe. But it begins with the first two verses. The terrible calamity. What is the terrible calamity? Exclamation mark. And what will make you comprehend what the terrible calamity is? The day on which men shall be as scattered moths, and the mountains shall be as loosened wool. Then as for him whose measure of good deeds is heavy, he shall live a pleasant life, and as for him whose measure of good deeds is light, his abode shall be the abyss. And what will make you know what it is? And the conclusion is a burning fire. And the if you look at what he's saying here in Islam, according to Islamic eschatology, good deeds, the person whose good deeds are heavier than 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 the person whose good deeds are heavier, they're the ones that are going to be um they're the ones that are going to live a pleasant life. This is roughly meaning that they're going to enter paradise, and the people whose good deeds are lighter, they're the ones who are going to enter hellfire. And there are a number of problems with this. As I said in other videos, the idea that only people who are not Muslims are going to enter hell is a bit of a misconception. In the Quran itself, it says that Muslims are going to enter or taste of hellfire. Now, Muslims would say, well, that doesn't mean they're going to enter hell itself. But again, this is kind of wordplay. They're really trying to find a way of justifying Muhammad's Muhammad's words, where he's basically admitting that even Muslims are going to hell, which makes you question the utility of being a Muslim. If you're going to taste hellfire yourself, what's the real value of following Muhammad? And even, I think it was Abu Bakr, Muhammad's direct successor, said that he wouldn't believe, even if he had one foot in paradise, he wouldn't believe that he wouldn't then be cast into hell. And this is a problem with Muslims. They don't really have any sort of eternal security, because this idea of appraising your good deeds and your bad deeds, and your good deeds having to be heavier than lighter, it really is a pre-Islamic concept. It's almost like an Egyptian concept, where you have Osiris weighing someone's heart against a feather, and if the feather is heavier, then you're condemned. It really is kind of a pre-Islamic pagan concept. But this is an important part of Islamic eschatology. Now, in Surah 102, it's called At Takathur, which is rivalry or competition, and the translation I have in my copy is the multiplication of wealth and children. And the context here is the Banu Abd al Manaf and the Banu Sam were these two Arab tribes that boasted against each other, and they counted their dead among their living in their boast. So they would supposedly they would claim that each tribe would claim that theirs is bigger, and they would not only include the living members of their tribes, but they would include the dead members of their tribe. So this is supposedly something that occurred, which prompted Muhammad to have this sort of revealed to him, showing him that this whole idea of valuing your wealth or your land or the number of tribesmen that you have is all futile, and that it's not really something Allah would do. And according to Islamic interpretation, the the uh, this surah deals with shubaharat or doubts, and shahawat or temptations, and these are the two things that have to be dealt with if you're going to live a proper Islamic life. So it's basically scolding these tribes that are vying with one another for supremacy. So it begins: abundance diverts you until you come to the graves. Nay, you shall soon know. Nay, nay, you shall soon know. Nay, if you had known with a certain knowledge, you should most certainly have seen the hell. Then you shall most certainly see it with the eye of certainty. Then on that day you shall most certainly be questioned about the boons. And here this is referring to, again, this idea of rewards or assets. Oh, thanks, GW. That's good. Yeah, I think the eschatology just means the end time. So when you see these surahs that are describing what Muhammad's interpretation of hell is and the judgment day, he's just talking about what's going to come about at the end times and eschatology. So, like in the Bible, the books that deal with eschatology are, of course, the Book of Revelation, but also chapters like Matthew 24 and um, other, particularly the prophets deal a lot with eschatology and what's going to happen at the end times. Books like Isaiah and even some of the minor prophets deal with this, and even really Genesis. When you look at Genesis, the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden deals with it to a certain extent. But yeah, so it just means like the end times, and soteriology is just the nature of salvation. So like in Islam, the soteriology, even though it's kind of confusing, it's very different than Christianity. Say, and this is one of the reasons Muhammad spends so much time attacking um, Christians and Jews, and particularly the idea of a Trinitarian God. You know, Muhammad keeps saying that that Allah has no partners. Hi, love and light. Uh, oh, thank you. Allah has no partners, and you see all of these anti-Trinitarian verses or verses denying the deity of Christ, because in Islam, the whole idea of salvation is rooted in worshiping Allah and following Muhammad, and these two things are inextricably linked. That's why in the Shahada you have you have an in the Shahada, Muslims recognize Allah, but it's tied directly to Muhammad. Muhammad being the final prophet of Islam. So yeah, going back to Surah 102, those two things, doubt and temptations. Um, these are the two things that Muslims are supposed to reject, but it goes even further than anything you would find in the Bible. For example, uh, in the Bible, it says you can't when not necessarily you can't, but it says you if you ask for something with doubt in your heart or the expectation that God's not going to fulfill it, you're not. It's really um, a sort of vain prayer. If you're being double minded is something that you're warned against. You need to have the expectation that God is going that you can depend upon God. But in Islam, it's not even an expectation so much as a demand that you can't express any sort of doubt about you can't expect any sort of confirmation. So in other words, like you have to believe in Muhammad and Allah, even though Muhammad hasn't provided any sort of reliable evidence that he's a prophet. So when you have the other Arabs questioning him, asking him how why we should believe in you, that you're plagiarizing things and that you're repeating old wives' tales and folklore, which he was. If you look at Muhammad, the historiography of Muhammad, this is basically what he did. He basically took bits and pieces from the Bible, things from Gnostic Gospels, from Arabic folklore, from other religions like Zoroastrianism, and cobbled them together. And when people pointed this out, he uh, simply said that they're evil and wicked, and he didn't provide any sort of evidence that he was a prophet. And now, when Jesus was accused by the Pharisees of not of committing blasphemy and being a devil, he and they asked him for a sign, and he said the only sign you'll find is the sign of Jonas. In other words, he would be resurrected after 3 days, after lying in the ground for 3 days. He'd be resurrected. Now, up to that point, Jesus had performed numerous signs to to the, before the Pharisees and before Israel. They just refused to admit. They would accuse him of performing them because of the devil, and that's when he warned them about committing the unpardonable sin. But the point is, he actually had provided all of these signs. And in fact, since his ministry was to the children of Israel, they were the ones that were seeing all of these miraculous signs. They were the ones that saw lepers being healed and people being raised from the dead, and all of these things, providing food miraculously. So they saw all of these things, and yet they still accused him of not giving them any confirmation that he was the Messiah. So he said, "I'm going to get the only sign you'll see is the sign of Jonas," and that's what happened. They did see him be resurrected, and they saw the results of that. The fact that the church uh, came together and was established. So my point is, Jesus actually did provide signs and wonders, and the greatest sign of all, which was his own resurrection. And yet, they still disbelieved. Whereas Muhammad didn't provide any sign that he was a prophet. He didn't do anything that would lead people to believe that he was an actual prophet. So their skepticism was warranted. It wasn't something that was born of simply hard-heartedness or animosity towards Muhammad's message. It was just really deeply rooted in reality. Hi, Mary. So, so again, that idea of doubts and temptations, and these being a snare to people who are reluctant to embrace Islam. I think that's really discredited when you actually read the Quran and realize that Muhammad doesn't really provide any sort of sign that he was a prophet, and there are all sorts of other signs that he was a false prophet and that he was just a congenital liar. So in Surah 103, it's called time, or the declining day, or eventide, and this is one of the shortest. I think this is the shortest or the second shortest surah in the Quran. It's only 3 verses long, and it begins, "I swear by the time," again Allah swearing to something that he created, that he and I mean God exists outside of time, but if you look at the Quran, the person they're describing as God is swearing by the time, which is a little odd. So in verse 2, it says, "Most surely man is in loss, except those who believe and do good and enjoin on each other truth and enjoin on each other patience." So this surah, the context of this surah is the idea that all men are lost except those with iman, and iman basically means faith or belief. So it's a belief in the metaphysical aspects of Islam. So these are Muslims who believe in the 6 articles of faith, angels, angels, predestination, all of these things. And people who do not have iman or are not Muslims, they're simply lost. Their lives are meaningless. And if you look at the interpretations of this by Islamic scholars, they conclude that even though this is one of the shortest, or one of the shortest verses or surahs in the Quran, that this encapsulates the entire Quran. So these 3 passages, basically describing how Muslims Muslims are the ones who know the truth and they do good. They and enjoin on each other patience. This is something that encapsulates the entire Quran, according to Muslim scholars. And when you look at it, it really is a good summary of the Quran, because it uses the same type of circular reasoning and non sequiturs that you find throughout the Quran. So this idea of non-Muslims being worthless, of Muslims being those who believe and do good and show and demand that others know the truth, even though even though the concept of truth and believing and doing good are undefined. So you basically have this surah telling people to do these things, but not defining what those things are. It's a perfect encapsulation of the Quran. So in that respect, the Islamic scholars are right. This surah, even though it's only 3 lines, is a perfect summary of the Quran, and it's also a perfect um, it gives you a perfect explanation of why the Quran is so pointless because it's telling you what Islam is by admitting that there really there really is no quantifiable definition of Islam. It's basically believing in Allah and doing good, even though Allah is not really defined, um, and doing good is not grounded in anything, any sort of system of ethics other than referring to good being what a Muslim is. So like again, it's like this self referential circular logic that doesn't really make any sense if you're outside of Islam. If you've been told this repeatedly throughout your entire life, it makes sense. Just like any other cult like Scientology or Mormonism would make sense if you're just having these things repeated your entire life and telling you that people who criticize them or critique them are wrong and are inspired by enemies of Islam, then of course you would think this made sense. But for anyone else, it would make absolutely no sense. So that is one of the shortest verses, or the second shortest verse, Surah 103, and the next surahs are a bit of a departure from a focus on eschatology, which is what the previous few surahs were. I'm going to do 3 or 4 of them in my next video, and then do another 3 afterwards. So I have about like maybe 3 or 4 videos left, and then we'll wrap it up. But thanks everyone for coming. Hi Miss Piggy. Hi Miss Bluebird. Uh, Hi Inky. I like your uh, I like your new profile pic. Red is my favorite color. Anyway, thanks everyone for coming. Be sure to hi Enoch. Be sure to share. I'd love to share these videos with more Muslims. Maybe get their perspective on this. Anyway, I will see you all next time.